Next, how will the economy shape the midterm elections? Overall inflation is down about 6% since the 9% high of the Biden administration, but Pew Research says three-quarters of Americans rate the economy as just fair or poor. Joining me now to discuss is Vance Ginn, former economic advisor to the Office of Budget and Management during President Trump's first term, and Fergus Hodgson, author of Financial Sovereignty for Canadians. Gentlemen, welcome. Vance, let's start with you. Fed Chair Jerome Powell says disinflation appears to be continuing, but Americans still feel pressure in the pocketbook. Who is to blame for this feeling, Republicans or Democrats?
Well, it's a great question. It's good to see that inflation is coming down, or the slowing from 9%, like you said, down to 3%, where we had the Biden inflation of more than 21% during those 4 years during President Biden. Now it is slowing, but it's still too high. And I think what we're feeling is the effects of really the Federal Reserve printing too much money, the supply not catching up. And so we've seen prices exceed or grow faster than what we're typically expecting. And so this really is a failure of Congress to keep spending in check and for the Federal Reserve to rein in the money supply. Until those two things happen, we're going to continue to see massive inflation. And you also see some price increases from the tariffs and the protectionism that's happened under the Trump administration. So a combination of these things has led to this affordability crisis, which I hope that we can start to see pared back quickly because too many families are hurting across the country.
Fergus, same question for you. Who's to blame for the sentiment that the economy isn't doing well? Republicans, Democrats, Congress?
Yeah, I don't like to put such a simplistic culpability in this on the situation. We both know that both parties, or this is a bipartisan problem. I agree with your other guests that inflation is still too high, and in any other situation or in previous eras, 3% inflation would not be grounds for lowering the interest rates in the economy. So, of course, we have monetized deficits. That's the chief culprit here. We do have, I agree, some inflationary pressure coming from other policies. We could say foreign policy pressure, geopolitical instability. So there's blame goes around, and it does precede this administration also.
Now, Vance, Powell attributes relatively high inflation mainly to tariffs. Do you agree with this assessment?
No, I mean, overall, when you look at the general level of prices, which is what we measure inflation, like the consumer price index, personal consumption expenditures, those are the general level of prices. Whereas tariffs influence the goods and services that we import, specifically goods. So it's not the general level of prices that changes. So I wouldn't put that all on the back of tariffs. However, it does change relative prices. Certain prices will change, which reduces people's budget constraints that they have. They can't spend as much, so they tend to buy less for other things, which can change the relative prices throughout the economy. So I would actually put the general level of prices, the inflation, on the back of Jerome Powell. And of course, behind that comes the excessive spending by Congress and the massive deficits that we've had of nearly $2 trillion a year. After you monetize that debt, then you're going to see more inflation. Milton Friedman said you have inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And that's exactly what we're seeing today. So Powell is actually the culprit. He needs to stop blaming others along the way.
All right, and Fergus, Democrats say the midterm elections are going to be about affordability, as they put it. But President Trump calls this a hoax. What's your take?
I agree with them on that assessment. Absolutely, the economy is the chief driver of voter concerns. It's not even close, really. So easily half of voters put cost of living, economic prospects as their top priority, far ahead of immigration, foreign policy, the drug war, and the like. So there's no doubt about that fact.
All right, and Vance, the Federal Reserve just this week announced a 0.25% rate cut. They appeared divided over that decision. What does that tell us about the economy heading into the midterms?
Yeah, Chris, we haven't seen this many who have disagreed. It's usually a consensus. They'll come up with a rate and then they'll all say, yes, we agree. But now there were three. There were two that said we didn't need to cut, two governors. And then there was one who said that they should have cut by 50 basis points instead of 25 basis points. So there is some disagreement here. I would rather them not cut. I think what they really should continue to focus on is the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. It remains about $6.5 trillion, where it was $4 trillion before the COVID shutdowns and lockdowns and everything else. But in fact, what the Fed started to do December 1st was to increase their monetary base, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, which is really just the basis of the money supply. So I'm concerned that we're actually, instead of seeing this disinflationary sort of situation, we may see inflationary pressure start to spike again, as we've been seeing over the last few months from increasing in the money supply.
Fergus, what do you make of the divide in the Federal Reserve?
I think it's healthy. There should be some disagreement, or at least some people speaking openly against the current policy. I agree that there should not have been a lowering of the rates. It smacks of pressure in the lead up to the midterms, that some kind of monetary stimulus. There is academic research demonstrating that monetary policy from the Federal Reserve and other central banks is cyclical in favor of the electoral cycle, boosting the incumbent power prior to elections. And that appears to be happening now, unfortunately.
And Vance, President Trump touts, of course, deregulation, oil drilling, trillions of dollars in foreign investment, and other policies as wins for the U.S. economy. But consumers, like we said, aren't exactly feeling the effects of these yet. So could consumers feel the effects of these in time for the midterms?
They could. I mean, going into next year, maybe we'll have more certainty about what the economic situation, what the policy situation is going to be. What's really happened since the early part of this year, really from the Liberation Day, when there was this across the board increase in tariffs, taxes on Americans when they import things from different countries, we've seen a lot of businesses freeze. They don't know what their cost structure is going to be. They don't know what their supply chain is going to be. And so this has led to less investment in the economy, less job creation. And in fact, we may be currently in a recession given some of those policies that have slowed down the economy and made us worse off. So that means that if they start to relieve some of those pressures, bring down the tariffs, allow for the tax cuts to be influenced throughout the economy, and the deregulation, which I do think is very important, if those things came to fruition, we would see a lower inflation next year, more economic growth, and more job creation. However, it seems like the administration continues to want to double down on more of this protectionist sort of attitude and higher tariffs. If that happens, we will not see the affordability sort of crisis begin to relieve itself because of bad policies that are put in the situation and into the economy.
Fergus, Vance just used the R word, recession, suggesting that we could actually be in one right now. What do you think?
It's so hard to know with the data available, right? And so I don't want to make an assertion on that. I do want to push back a little bit on the tariff situation. There has been messy implementation, and I have to agree that there's been a lot of unpredictability. The challenge is the Trump administration is trying to assert a new Monroe Doctrine, or the Trump corollary, and he's seeking to use trade as a tool in that strategy. So it's going beyond the economy there. It's more of a foreign policy tactic. And it is, like I said, it's a tool that has a price. We're aware of that.
And Vance, what would you say is the president's easiest path to create economic relief for people that they can actually notice by 2026?
I think it'd be a combination of three things. One, continue this deregulation path, because that's going to open up the supply side of the economy and allow for prices to have more downward pressure on them across the economy. I think they should also focus on less government spending, especially deficit spending. If they could do that, that would also contribute to less monetization by the Fed and putting more money supply in the economy. And then finally, I think they should start to roll back the tariffs and this more protectionist sort of rhetoric, and instead focus on free trade, especially with our allies, and instead of putting higher and higher costs of importing from them. And all those things would reduce this increasing pressure on inflation over the next year.
Gentlemen, in closing here, I just want to hear from both of you on this last question. Fergus, of course, you're not a pollster, but you have a unique view on the election. So which party do you think will perform better on the economy in 2026?
Gosh, I don't. That's a broad question. In terms of the actual outcome, I follow the betting markets closely, and it does seem clear that the Republicans will hold the Senate and maybe lose the House.
All right, and Vance, same question for you.
During midterms, you usually have the opposing party that's not in power. They usually will win some seats, especially if this affordability issue doesn't go away and the Trump administration can't get a hold of this inflation throughout the economy. It's going to be really tough for Republicans to keep the Senate or the House going into next year. So they've got a lot of work to do between now and then.
All right, Vance Ginn, president of Ginn Economic Consulting, and Fergus Hodgson, director of Econ Americas. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.